Hello and a very warm welcome. We are broadcasting from the Bharat Mandapam. Behind me, the lights setting on India's G20. It's been a historic G20. The Prime Minister wanted this to be the catalyst of a new world order. On this special broadcast, we're going to do a before and after postmortem. I'm joined by three special guests. We had them with us on the same panel before the world leaders descended on New Delhi for the G20. And we have them back again, that dream team. Lots of conversation around different things that were said by Ian Bremmer, president of the Eurasia Group, joining us from the United States in New York. With us also this time from Taiwan is Kishore Mehbubani, well-known Singapore diplomat, author. He's been president of the United Nations Security Council, and India's top think tanker Samir Saran, president of the Observer Research Foundation, joining us as well despite nursing a sore throat. So thank you, Samir. I appreciate it. I want to go across first and foremost to Ian Bremmer, because the sense that I picked up from the panel was that the expectations about there being a joint communique were muted before all the world leaders landed in the capital for this G20 Leaders Summit. Mr. Bremmer, when you do a before and after postmortem, looking at what you thought would happen in Delhi, and now that you know most of what the outcome has been, how do you think it's gone?
Well, I thought it was going to be successful, and it slightly exceeded my expectations because of the joint communique. Probably made a little bit easier by the fact that Xi Jinping wasn't there. I don't think that Xi's absence really detracted from India's success and from the broader G20 success of the meeting. I also would point out that this joint communique, which did not discuss or call out Russia directly, but did uphold the UN Charter and abhor any restrictions or interventions against a country's territorial integrity and sovereignty, that formulation better reflects the interests of the G20, better reflects the interests of the countries that are attending. First and foremost, that of India, the host country. So I think that this does reflect a lot of hard work on the part of the Indian government, and particularly the Sherpa for the G20, a good working relationship between India and the United States, and a successful G20 summit this weekend.
Kishore Mehbubani, you're currently in Taiwan. You were meeting some top Taiwanese politicians for dinner, which is where we literally requested you to come out and join us. So give us a sense of how this is being decoded in Taiwan, and especially given the fact that Xi Jinping didn't come, there is a joint communique at the end, slightly muted language around the Russia-Ukraine war. What have been your main takeaways?
Well, unfortunately, I can tell you that the dinner in Taiwan didn't discuss the G20 meeting. It discussed actually whether or not Taiwan would become the next Ukraine, which is, of course, the big issue of the day in Taiwan. But to give you my perspective on the G20 meeting, I agree with Ian that I think India can regard this G20 meeting as a big success. Firstly, I think getting the African Union as a member is a huge achievement. Because in most global meetings, the European Union, which represents 5 or 6% of the world's population, is hugely overrepresented. I mean, they send 3 or 4 representatives for every global meeting, which is crazy for such a small group of people on the planet Earth. The Africans, as you know, are going to be the fastest growing population on planet Earth. And the fact that Prime Minister Modi succeeded in getting the African Union as a permanent member of the G20 is a huge achievement. And the effects will be there for the next 20, 30 years. As the weight of Africa grows in global affairs, it will be well represented in the G20. And secondly, I also agree with Ian that it's actually quite remarkable that there was a agreed joint statement. There was actually some fears there will be no joint statement, but there was one. And in some ways, actually, Ukraine has done India a big favor by criticizing the statement. Because when Ukraine criticized the statement, it showed that the statement was very balanced and neutral. it was trying to sort of understand that there are two sides to this issue, that certainly Russian invasion of Ukraine is illegal, no question about it. But at the same time, to find a solution, you have to get all the parties together. And so for India to succeed in getting a joint statement, but it's endorsed by everybody and criticized by Ukraine, shows that maybe at the end of the day, it was a kind of a balanced statement, and that shows where India is heading.
Okay. Samir Saran, you lost your voice the last couple of days, but India's voice was heard loud and clear on the global stage. Your before and after postmortem in terms of what you thought we'll end up with and where this Delhi declaration really leaves us.
Look, Rahul, we are thrilled. I think what we have been able to put together is outstanding, and under the circumstances is beyond anyone's expectation. So if anyone says they knew this would be the net result of the meeting, they deserve an Oscar. So I am clearly thrilled right now. I am over the moon. I'm proud to belong to India that was able to put together a very ambitious is the operating word here, declaration, which and this is something that Ian and I will have a longer conversation on later. But I think this document, in some sense, is the intellectual and political successor to the outcome at Pittsburgh in 2009. At that time, we had put together an economic framework for the future. The G20 replaced the G8 at that time and became the body for economic coordination. I think this time around, G20, despite the Ukraine crisis and the distractions and attendant discussions on that particular subject, this has become the development G20. SDGs, Global South, and issues that matter to humanity have been catered to in this particular document. So that's the first point, Rahul. This is certainly the successor to Pittsburgh, a new phase of G20's evolution. The second point I want to make is that Ian is right. The language is tougher and it is far more robust in terms of adhering to international law and the UN Charter, while, of course, the reference to Russia may have been deleted from the Bali Declaration. So it is tougher language on the actions of Russia without villainizing Russia, but more focus on upholding principles, which again suits all the G20 countries, especially some who face other neighbors who may want to change international boundaries. But please understand, the Security Council, with members who belong to the G20, could not pass a similar resolution in that council. One of them used to veto it. Here, 20 countries with veto passed that very simple upholding of international law and the UN Charter. So it's really something to be able to make that happen. So all credit to Team India, all credit to the Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, and the Sherpa. I'm happy, Rahul.
Ian Bremmer, I was reading just before we set this live show up a piece in Bloomberg which looked at what was happening in Delhi as a mini face-off, India versus China, Modi versus Xi, and saying to the extent that this was a limited contest, Modi scored 1 over Xi or India scored 1 over China. Given the end outcome, do you think that's a fair assessment?
Sure. But I mean, let's keep in mind a couple of things. One is that the Indian economy is growing gangbusters right now. Modi, very popular at home, has a strong relationship with the United States and will, whether Biden or Trump is successful in 2024, very strong relationship with Japan, but also has not alienated, at least not yet, major members of the Global South. China's in a very different position. I mean, the big headlines this week, Xi Jinping not showing up at the G20, Italy announcing they're going to be leaving Belt and Road. The Indonesians, of course, they were thought to be the most important new member joining the BRICS. They chose not to be a part of it because they didn't want to have to be making choices or perceived as making choices against the G7. So this is not a good time for China. It's not a great week for China. I'm not surprised that India is making successful noises, but there's also been a lot of headlines in the United States that this is showing that China is somehow jettisoning the existing world order, that they want to build their own. They're not going to be any part of the G20 going forward. That's not true. I'm willing to bet you dollars to donuts on this show next year that Xi Jinping will be in Brazil for their G20 presidency. They will be sending high-level members for the ministerials going forward. This is not suddenly the end of China's meaningful role on the global stage or peak China. Samir and I talked about this at the beginning of the G20, the idea that India is making some great decisions right now, but they're still a minimum of 10 to 15 years behind the Chinese. That doesn't change just because you had a very successful weekend. So good marks for Modi, good marks for India, good marks for everyone attending the G20 this weekend, the G19. You added the African Union, you subtracted the Chinese and the Russians. But going forward, this is a long, long road in a dramatically changing global order.
Samir Saran, these aren't two countries that punch in the same economic weight category just at this moment. India most certainly behind China in terms of its economic growth story. But to the extent that this was a diplomatic and geopolitical contest, do you buy that at the end of the weekend round, it's Modi 1, Xi 0, India 1, Modi 0, just in the limited context of what was at play in Delhi?
Look, if diplomacy was a boxing round, this round belongs to India. Clearly, but Rahul, something else also happened here. And I think that is the problem when you are absent from big arenas. And maybe that also explained the absence of Xi from G20 this time around. Not only did you see Italy withdrawing from the BRI, but you also saw a bunch of European nations joining up, teaming up with the Middle East and India to put together a new connectivity offering. Something, let's be very clear, is a determined alternative to the BRI. Now, this is $47 trillion of GDP in terms of the countries who have signed up for this agreement. Now, if we can somehow find the leadership and, of course, the courage to make this work out, the $47 trillion countries who have teamed up, I think we can actually carve a more sustainable and certainly a more durable connectivity project in this part of the world that could become an exemplar for when we have to connect into Africa and Latin America and other parts of the world. So I think you are also seeing at this particular moment of time, the countries who have till now only been complaining about the BRI and Chinese action now beginning to try and map out an alternative rather than just protest. So that also happened at this particular time. And I just want to leave one more thought with you. The other image that tickled me coming out of the G20, and again, this is for Kishore and Ian to consider as well, was of the IPSA countries with the US and a joint statement coming after that. So is US coming into the IPSA play? Is that going to be the heft? Is that going to be the financier of IPSA being more ambitious in terms of its development going forward and not having to rely on the BRICS where China becomes the big banker? So I'm just leaving it out there. I think watch that space. IPSA plus USA is an interesting mix.
Kishore Mehbubani, from an Indian point of view, you always come across slightly leaning on the Chinese side. If this was a diplomatic boxing bout, virtually, could you build on what you just heard from Ian and Samir? And would you too concede it's Modi 1, Xi 0, India 1, China 0, just at this moment?
Well, I think the first point I want to emphasize is that economic growth is not a zero-sum game. It's not like playing in a military game, sure, which is a zero-sum game. Economic growth is not. So if India grows, China grows, US grows, it's a positive sum game. But at the same time, I think it's important, as Ian was suggesting, don't judge a boxing match on one weekend or one round. Let me give you my successor is Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, was Professor Denny Kwa, a well-known economist. And he just tweeted this figure. He said that if India grows every year at 2% faster than China, every year at 2% faster than China, it will take India 85 years to catch up with China. So, let's be realistic at the end of the day about the economic weight of countries. And, and at the end of the day, I think let's forget the zero-sum games and talk about the positive effects. Because what India has done, it has created the G20 as a positive launching pad for the Global South. And it actually strengthens Brazil for its next meeting, because now that you have the African Union as a permanent member of the G20, it changes the chemistry of the G20 significantly, because the voice of the Global South is represented much more. And that's not a loss, by the way, not necessarily a loss for the United States, and not a loss for China. And the BRI, by the way, all I ask you to do is, in next month, China will be having a BRI summit in Beijing. Ask yourself a simple question. There are 193 countries in the world. Italy has left the BRI. How many countries will come to participate in the BRI meeting in China? You focus on the one that is leaving, or the 140 that are coming. So, these are realities you cannot erase.
Well,
I'm not being pro-China. I'm just giving you data that points out the fact that India's role in the world is growing, China's role in the world is growing, and frankly, the role of the Global South is growing, and that's what we should be celebrating.
Rahul, can I quickly comment?
sure, but Italy was the one country in Europe which was a part of the BRI. They're pulling out. So that's just not just one country. That's a very important country, because they could have brought others into the fold, and they instead are choosing to go out. So I have lots of questions, but Samir wants to make a quick interjection. So Samir Saran, go for it.
Quick point. I think broadly, I think Kishore would perhaps be correct in many assessments. But let me just tell you that numbers don't work that way. In the next 14 to 15 years, if India is going to be 18, 17 or 18 or 19 trillion dollars, it would not mean that the Chinese would have moved from where they are today. The whole basis of countries catching up is that at some point you start stagnating. And the big China question is that have they reached that point where they are now plateauing and stagnating? We have seen Japan and many others experience this for decades, this stagnation. So 85 years, I think, maybe pushing it too far. I would certainly agree with Ian and others if we were to talk about a decade and a half, the time where the difference would be significantly reduced, or rather would be insignificant in its implications. So that's one part. But second point, very quickly, again, it's not about the 140 or 130 who arrive at Emperor Xi's court. Who are they? And that is important. And the minute many of them have an alternative to the BRI, which was not available till now, many of them will not come to the court. They went to the court because the Chinese were the only game in town. They were the only ones who were investing in the infrastructure and other industrial aspirations of developing countries. My whole point that I made in my opening remarks was that if rich countries with partners like Brazil, India and others, if we can reach out and if we can build the futures of those who seek a better life, BRI will have competition. BRI is the only game in town. Even if it is a bad one, people are playing it. Get better ones on the board and you will see many desert the BRI. That's the point I'm making, Rahul.
So you've said a couple of things, and I want to build on the question of what happens in China next. Okay, go for it. I like this. It's sounding like a good verbal joust. So go for it, Kishore Mehbooba. Yeah, go for it. Go.
No, I don't disagree with the points that Samir has made. But at the end of the day, he may be right that China's growth has plateaued, and India will therefore catch up much faster. But, I have, over the last 30 years, been watching China. I have heard about the death of China every decade. Unfortunately, decade after decade, all the people who predict that the growth of China has ended have failed in their predictions. And so we'll find out. In any case, we'll find out. This year is 2023. We'll find out in 2033 whether or not China's growth has plateaued. And I always believe that you don't plan again, your best case scenarios that China has collapsed. You plan against the worst case scenarios that China may be growing very fast again. And on the question of Italy, let me give you one statistic that was, we are still so obsessed with the Europeans. Italy, frankly, Italy's economy is declining. And over the last, let me ask you a simple question. The European Union has a $17 trillion GNP. ASEAN, where I come from, Southeast Asia, has a $3 trillion GNP. From the years 2010 to 2020, who added more to global economic growth? Was it the European Union or was it ASEAN?
I got to jump in here.
ASEAN added more to global economic growth than the European Union. So why are we so fixated on the Europeans?
I got to jump in.
Let me put that question to Ian Bremmer, because I spoke to Dr. Geeta Gopinath just a couple of hours before we did this recording, and she said that China will continue to grow. One is the aspect of stagnation, the other is the concern about decline. Far from the IMF's current assessment seems to be that China, despite what's happening with debt, despite what's happening in the real estate sector, will continue to grow. So Ian Bremmer, where do you come out on the question of stagnation, decline, or continuing growth?
Look, I think that I agree with Kishore that it's too early to talk about things like peak China and stagnation. That seems to be an ideologically freighted, sort of discussion that's mostly had by people that really want China to fall apart. It's too early to make that assessment. But Italy matters. Italy matters a lot, and you saw how excited and how proud the Chinese were when the Italians said that they were going to join BRIY, because it was the first G7 country to do so. It's a part of Europe. It meant that the Chinese were having success in ensuring that the Europeans weren't just going to be pro-US, but were going to balance between the Americans, and the Chinese would do both. The Chinese wouldn't be contained. They wouldn't be ganged up on. We saw the same thing with the Chinese and the 16+1, which then expanded. The East Europeans, the South Europeans, which became much weaker and fell apart when the Chinese were supporting Russia right before the invasion of Ukraine. So the Europeans as a whole are looking much more aligned with the United States on China. Ursula von der Leyen talking about de-risking as opposed to decoupling, the exact same formulation that Biden has. Why? Because they both formulated it together. So that's why Italy is so important for China, not because the Italian economy or because the Italian prime minister matters, because it's symptomatic of a bigger problem that the Chinese are presently experiencing, some of which is their own fault, some of which is politicized from the West. Now, I think that the exciting thing here is not whether or not China falls apart. In the same way that people have been saying that China is going to collapse for decades, people have been talking about the coming Chinese century for decades now, too. And that's gone. What we are seeing with the BRICS, with the G7, and most importantly with the G20 is a recognition that no country is going to own the 21st century. We have global challenges like pandemics, like climate change, like disruptive technologies, like the absence of adequate development finance and the challenges of globalization. And in order to address those challenges, it must be done multilaterally. It must be done globally. The Americans, the Chinese, the Indians, the Japanese, the EU must participate, and the African Union needs to be a part of the conversation. And the G20 imperfectly nonetheless represents a significant positive step in the recognition of that. This is not a win primarily for India or the US. It's not a loss primarily for China. It is rather a step on the road to recognizing that 10 billion people on this planet by 2100 are only going to succeed if the G20 as an organization becomes more successful.
Let Kishore Mehbubani respond to that. The idea that Emperor Xi would somehow lead China to its glorious past, where it would be the most important country in the world, where the world would revolve around the Chinese pole, that this would somehow be the Chinese century. Ian Bremmer articulating that this G20 and the existence of the G20 suggests that no such thing is going to happen. There is no Chinese century. Yes, of course, China is important, make no mistake, as is the United States, as is India, the European Union, the African Union, all of them together. So Emperor Xi needs to give up the idea of this somehow being then the Chinese century. Kishore Mehbubani.
Yes, first, let me agree with Ian Bremmer before I disagree with Ian Bremmer. Both he and Samir are friends of mine. I agree with Ian Bremmer that at the end of the day, the 10 billion people on planet Earth in the year 2100 are going to ask themselves the simple question whether the G20 prepared humanity and dealt with the major global challenges we face. No, the common global challenges we face, whether it's climate change, pandemics, global financial crisis, terrorism, whatever it is. I think that's what we should focus on. I agree with Ian. At the end of the day, forget who wins, who loses in G20. What's more important is the G20 addressing the common concerns of humanity. And I strongly endorse what Ian said, that we should come together and deal with the common challenges that humanity is facing. 8 billion of us now, 10 billion in 2100. Now, on the question of the Chinese century, I've never, ever said that the 21st century will be the Chinese century. My book, The Asian 21st Century, which has been downloaded 3.24 million times over in 160 countries around the world, says that the 21st century will be the Asian century. And the Asians, by the way, still make up 55% of the world's population, 4.5 billion out of 8 billion. And by the way, India is very, very much a big part of the story of the Asian century. And indeed, as Angus Maddison, a British historian, pointed out, that from the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800 out of the last 2,000 years, the two largest economies of the world were always those of India and China. So what we're seeing is the natural return of India and China. And by the way, including ASEAN. I mean, the ASEAN is the most underrated organization in the whole world. And you're creating a new growth triangle, the new CIA growth triangle, not the Central Intelligence Agency, but China, India, ASEAN. And these 3.5 billion people in China, India, ASEAN are going to drive global economic growth for the next 100 years. Take my word for it.
As an aside, Ambassador Mehbubani, the only other person I know who's able to slip in a line of promotion about his book or his film, no matter what the conversation is, Bollywood star Shah Rukh Khan. So the second time you've done it, and it's a good one. Go get his book. It's a fun one to read. I've read it, and it is genuinely interesting. But I want to ask this question to Ian Bremmer about the corridor that's being built, the India, Mid-East, Europe corridor. President Biden committed to it in a big way. You had the Saudis on the table, you had the Europeans on the table, India pushing for it. Many of the BRI projects have turned out to be white elephants. This is seen in some ways as a counter to the BRI. How effective a counter do you see this infrastructure project being once it's up and going, the corridor?
Well, first of all, Samir has already talked about this as a development global summit, and that was, of course, a very significant focus. No one has mentioned my good friend Ajay Banga, and this is his first major multilateral as the new president of the World Bank. India background, very strong commitment and experience to the Global South. but an American and appointed and very close to President Biden and the administration. That's a big success in this meeting. He's been driving very hard to unlock more money specifically for World Bank commitments to multilateral projects in lower and mid-developing countries. So yes, I'm delighted to see that that is a part of the focus and allowed for a much more productive meeting bilateral between Modi and Biden at this trip. Having said that, this is still a comparatively small announcement in the context of the money that BRI is putting out around the world, even with China under more economic difficult circumstances today. It's over 10 years, the announcements of these investments going into this new corridor, a lot of private sector leverage. The initial U.S. commitment and contribution needs to be approved by Congress. That is not a trivial matter in the United States, either this year or going forward. So there still are big questions about how much American leadership can be committed for the medium to long term, given the political instability in the United States. It pains me to say that, but it nonetheless is the case. So yes, a step, a positive step, but I think Samir made the point that as long as BRI is the only game in town, that's where everyone's going to go. And I agree with Kishore that there will be a lot more countries showing up at BRI than there would be at any other multilateral framework for economic development. The reason for that is because the Chinese are still writing the biggest checks. The Africa Union doesn't want to be primarily aligned with China. They just don't have anybody else that cares, don't have anybody else that's investing in. I think that this weekend's announcement doesn't change that reality.
Final words, Samir Saran, I'll start with you. The Prime Minister calling for a virtual summit in November. The idea really being to look at the outcomes in the Delhi Declaration to see what can be done before the baton is handed. It's already been handed over, but before Brazil gets really started, to see what can be done to push forward the Delhi agenda. What do you see happen from here? Samir Saran.
Rahul, of course, there are three big dates or rather moments in the coming 3 months that are of interest to all of us. The UNGA, the high-level week in a couple of weeks from now. Then you have, of course, the discussions around the COP28, and then the handover to Brazil of the G20 presidency. And in some sense, many of the issues that have been discussed, and I think Ajay Banga is a good introduction into this discussion by Ian, I think will also be revolving around what happens on the reforms, or rather the recapitalization or the more efficient utilization of the World Bank. The first report, the Larry Sama Enkesing report, is out. The second edition is expected during the Morocco meeting, and that's the third event. You know, the World Bank and how they respond to a very clear and ambitious agenda that the declaration in Delhi has outlined for additional capital for development and climate action, right? So there are these three big things, and I think it is useful for the presidency to agree to a pathway and then to work on it over the next 90 days before it hands over to its successor. We saw that, of course, in Bali, to be fair, Ukraine kind of hawked the entire discussion, and everything else was minimalist, and it did not leave an imprint. But this declaration is so ambitious that it would be useful to set up smaller groups and teams in the Troika, India, Brazil, South Africa, that will run with this over the next 3 years. I think that's the first point. I could not help, Rahul, I have to intervene. I was left out of that wonderful conversation between Ian and Kishore. Look, I think one of the big takeaways from the Indian G20 presidency is that partnerships matter. Countries and group of countries that are able to attract partners with significant weight and significant competence and capabilities will be who will succeed in this century. You cannot go it alone, and countries who believe that they can do it alone will struggle. And I think that's the takeaway. Vasudeva Kutumbakam, we are one earth, one family, one future. That's the model. And I think India has to adhere to that model. Build partnerships, work for the benefit of all. And of course, there should be no gloating over or gleeful exultations if some countries are struggling. In fact, to all who think that unstable China is good, actually it's a disaster. So we should all hope that better political leadership prevails and Chinese growth is maintained because it benefits everyone. A stable China, a sensible China, a rational China is in all our interests.
You know, it's starting to rain here at the Bharat Mandapam. The weather's just been fabulous. You know, you've got this light breeze, pollution best ever in the whole year. So, you know, lots of Delhi and India really on top song here on the ground and in the cricket match against Pakistan as well. So, Kishore Mehbubani, since you're in Taiwan, I want to end over there because one of the things that happen in autocratic dictatorial countries when there is an economic crisis is the tendency to resort to nationalism. And I'm reading a lot of commentary from American generals, admirals, increasing the probability of a Chinese attack in some form on Taiwan or trying to coerce Taiwan and bringing the timelines ahead. It was said to happen sometime, say, 2027. Post now, it's being said the window could be narrowing because of economic distress and because the kind of military capabilities that China has been able to build sitting in Taiwan. What's your reading on this?
Two quick points. First, I want to quickly agree with Samir Saran when he emphasized you've got to talk about one Earth, one family, one future. And I agree with him about the three important meetings. But there's actually another important meeting taking place in November, hosted by the United States of America, which is the APEC Forum in November. And the Secretary of State, John Kerry, hopes that that will be the summit meeting that will bring together the United States and China on climate change. And if it does, then frankly, it'll be a huge achievement in terms of delivering one Earth, one family, one future. And I hope that India will join APEC too very soon. Now, on your question on Taiwan, I had a very interesting dinner in Taiwan. I was sitting next to a former vice president. I want to emphasize, she's a DPP vice president, not KMT. As you know, the KMT is the one that is aligned towards working with China, and the DPP wants to be more independent of China. And it's interesting that what she was saying is that one way for China and Taiwan to come together is not to talk about one China, but one Chinese. And this is the DPP proposal. So you see, if you can have interesting proposals like that, the reason I mention it is that there are ways and means of diffusing many of the serious geopolitical tensions we face in the world. And if you ask me to make a simple bet as to whether or not there'll be a war over Taiwan over the next 10 years, I predict that there'll be no war. Because I think all the sides involved, United States, China, Taiwan, and others, understand that the stakes in Taiwan are very, very high, and that everyone loses if there's a war in Taiwan.
Okay.
And since
your reading is that there will be no war, which is quite contrary to what we're picking up from American strategic circles, from their generals and admirals. Ian Bremmer, it's beginning to pour now. So with your risk hat on, Kishore Mehbubani says 10 years, no war, probability is very low, everyone loses. But that was said about Russia's chances of attacking Ukraine as well before the attack did happen. And the Americans were right on that occasion. What's your reading now, Ian Bremmer?
Sadly, if there's likelihood of war in the nearer term, it would be between, once again, the Americans / NATO and Russia. There is a proxy war militarily and technologically being fought right now in Ukraine with no end in sight. That is still the danger that needs to be managed and contained to the greatest degree on a daily basis. But look, I agree. I don't with Kishore. I don't think that there's any intention of the Chinese to go to war. Not with the U.S. Not over Taiwan. I think the Americans feel the same way. But the relationship is poor. The level of trust is non-existent, and there's not a lot of engagement. That engagement is improving, but it comes after almost 3 years of virtually none with the pandemic. And so, as we all know, sometimes you don't want war, but sometimes war wants you. I think that's Tolstoy. It's certainly true that these are two governments that are capable of making mistakes, that are capable of making misjudgments, and that are capable of thinking the worst about the other. The Americans and Chinese both capable. So we need to still be vigilant. We can't be complacent. And if we end up not having war in the next 10 years, it's in part because smart people, thoughtful people, hopefully including the four of us talking today, are working hard to help ensure that that remains the case.
Well, many analysts were doubtful that there would be a joint communique and a Delhi declaration at the end of the G20. If somebody had asked me, would you be able to get Ian Bremmer, Kishore Mehbubani and Samir Saran live for a post-mortem discussion at 30 minutes notice just after the G20 got over, I would have said the probability is immensely low. But it's just been that kind of a weekend. As I said, the weather is glorious. It's raining just this little bit, not too much to bring the entire city down. Delhi is in full flow. India has been on song, but India has flattered to deceive in the past. And therefore, just keep your head down, get the job done is what India needs to keep doing. Thank you very much. Samir Saran, Ian Bremmer and Kishore Mehbubani. Kishore Mehbubani stepped out of an important dinner. Ian Bremmer has a flight to catch. Samir is still nursing that cold, although our viewers wouldn't have picked up much of a bad cold. He got on and he's fully charged on. And thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Hope to have you back again on our network. Thank you for taking out time and giving us the benefit of the power of your insights. You're on board the Newstrack. In India and internationally, the G20 Leaders Summit is being feted for the Delhi Declaration, the joint communique which came about with consensus despite the pressures of the Russia-Ukraine war. But one section of the Indian opposition is raising questions around the cost of the G20 summit, and they're banding about the figure of 4,100 crores. Now, this 4,100 crore rupee figure is misleading because it includes not just the actual operational expense of organizing the G20, but also the capital expense involved in building the Bharat Mandapam, which is an asset that will last much longer than just this one G20 summit, and therefore displays complete financial illiteracy and a misplaced sense of how costs are actually allocated. Our fact-check desk with this report.
A resounding international success, but the G20 hosted in New Delhi has stirred political controversy at home due to its expenses. Opposition parties, the Trinamool Congress and the Congress, have accused the government of massive overspending to make the G20 summit happen. Allegations of a 300% cost overrun, with 4,100 crore rupees spent instead of the original 990 crore budget allocated for the event, have been making headlines. India Today's fact-check team, however, has found these accusations to be misleading.
Experts are very clear that there is no way the cost of construction of Bharat Mandapam can be clubbed with G20 cost. The reason being, the infrastructure is going to be used for decades to come and is also likely to earn rental incomes. They say that only advertisements and decoration at the venue can be clubbed with the cost of G20.
When we delve into the numbers, the 4,100 crore rupee price tag placed on the entire G20 event appears grossly deceptive and misleading. According to several media reports, the centre allocated over 990 crore rupees towards organising the event under India's G20 presidency. But a tweet by Union Minister Meenakshi Lekhi on September the 4th seems to have sparked the controversy. She shared a document titled City Improvement in the Area primarily used by G20 delegates, which totaled around 4,110 crore rupees. Upon closer examination, however, India Today's fact-check team found that 88% of the total amount mentioned in the document actually went into building permanent infrastructure. In other words, capital expenditure on the ITPO or the Bharat Mandapam complex at New Delhi's Pragati Maidan. Further research revealed that the redevelopment and revamping of this ultra-modern complex was conceived way back in 2017 at a budget of 2,254 crore rupees. An additional 800 crore rupees was allocated for decongestion of roads and building tunnels in and around Pragati Maidan. Experts argue that it's misleading to include the cost of permanent structures like Bharat Mandapam in the G20 Summit event expenses, especially when such complexes will be utilized for many years and decades to come.
4,100 करोड़ का अगर बाइफर्केशन हम लोग देखें तो इसमें 3,600 करोड़ रुपया केवल जो भारत मंडपम जो इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर क्रिएट हुआ है, जो कन्वेंशन सेंटर बना है, इसमें खर्च हुआ है। जो कैपिटल एसेट्स जो क्रिएट हुई है, जिसका 3,600 करोड़ रुपया वैल्यूएशन लगाया जा रहा है, तो ये फ्यूचर में भी हमें रेंटल्स देगा। और जिस तरीके से विज्ञान भवन भारत में बना हुआ है, दिल्ली में बना हुआ है विज्ञान भवन रेंटल पर प्राइवेट सेक्टर को भी दिया जाता है और सरकारी प्रोग्राम भी होते हैं, उसी तरीके से भारत मंडपम इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर जो क्रिएट हुआ है, ये फ्यूचर में भी रेंटल देगा। तो इसको खर्चा मान लेना अनुचित है।
The G20 Sherpa Amitabh Kant insists that the actual spending is even lower than the approved budget and that the government will soon release the actual figures.
It is being compiled by our logistic division. Everybody will get to know what is the expenditure. There's an approval and the expenditure is less than the approval line.
Claims of overspending not as straightforward as they seem. The full picture of G20 expenses will become clear once the official breakdown is released in totality. With Balkrishna, this is India Today's Fact Check team.
This is where we wrap up the Newstrack tonight. For your time and your trust, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow evening. Till then, from all of us here, goodbye, good night.